Okay, the first thing for us to get out in the open is that between plants and animals, as a kingdom, the animals came first. Plants trail them by at least 200 million years. Intuitively, this sounds impossible because the animals would have needed plants at the base of their food web. And in fact, the truth of this statement, animals evolving before plants, is really based on a technicality because of the way that the plant kingdom is limited to those plants that have lived on dry land. All of the rhodophytes and chlorophytes and the non-plant streptophytes we talked about in the previous lecture, as well as some of the other photosynthetic organisms outside of the archaeoplastida, ranging from cyanobacteria to the dinoflagellates. They were totally around before 450 million years ago, and they did just a fine job of supporting thriving communities of aquatic life, likely stretching back to even before there were animals. But these photosynthetic organisms are not included in the plant kingdom. And so the animals of the late Proterozoic and Cambrian actually did have plenty to eat, but it all came from photosynthetic non-plants. Okay, that's over and done. And so now we can turn the clock ahead to fairly late in the Ordovician, about 450 million years ago, and well after the Cambrian explosion, which was the greatest diversification of animal life the planet has ever seen. The Ordovician is where the plant kingdom takes its origin. And now the question becomes, why then and not before? There are probably many issues at play here. I'm going to make the case that this was the first time in which a significant motivation for moving onto dry land was coupled with the possibility of coming out of the water without having your DNA get fried to a crisp by UV radiation. First, I mentioned in an earlier video that an icehouse event, a period of global glaciation, immediately followed the Great Oxidation 2.5 billion years ago at the start of the Proterozoic. Even after that icehouse, the Huronian/Makganyena event, there were other long periods of either snowball or slushball Earth continuing throughout the Proterozoic and even extending into the Phanerozoic, with the last one occurring about the same time that plants made their move onto dry land. When a global cooling of this magnitude occurs, the polar ice caps grow thick and sea levels drop. The shorelines of the receding oceans would be places where organisms face progressively drier conditions. Moreover, colder temperatures means that there's less evaporation from the ocean surface and less precipitation generally. The estimate is that for every degree Celsius of temperature change, there's about a 7% change in global precipitation. Colder global climate means a drier global climate. So the Ordovician icehouse, which was really a tiny one compared to the icehouse events of the Cryogenian, would have been a double whammy of drought that would have selected for tolerance of progressively drier conditions. Of course, staying in the sea as it receded was also an option, but for the organisms that got stranded upland or upstream in the drying habitats, the choice was either adapt or die. But again, these icehouses, double whammies of drought, had been occurring throughout the Proterozoic. The Cryogenian period in the late Proterozoic, literally the frozen time, was named in recognition of this global climate situation. So why didn't the transition to dry land occur then? Well, one important difference between the Cryogenian and Ordovician icehouses was the level of atmospheric oxygen. Throughout the Proterozoic, atmospheric O2 was there, but at very low levels, like 1% at most. The start of the Phanerozoic is marked by substantial O2 bump. This is one of the things getting the credit for that explosive radiation of the animals occurring during the Cambrian. And importantly for our argument here, higher O2 in the atmosphere resulted in the establishment of an ozone layer to serve as a UV shield, thereby allowing life to move out of the water and onto dry land. Ozone is O3, and it would not have been possible to form any appreciable ozone layer until there was adequate oxygen, O2, in the atmosphere. By the time we get to the Ordovician, the higher levels of atmospheric oxygen would likely have been around for long enough to form an appreciable ozone shield, which would allow life to come out of the water. So with this Ordovician glaciation, you would have had both strong selection for adapting to dryness and also an ozone layer that would for the first time make terrestrial life, that is, life out of the water, possible. Considering these issues, an Ordovician timing for the invasion of land actually makes perfect sense. The oldest plant fossils we have are sketchy. A few spores and fragments is really all there is, but a couple of things about the spores are really telling. First, there's the trilete marks. Think Mercedes symbol. These are the ridges that were left from when the spores were formed as four equal triangular wedges splitting off from a tetrad. Trilete mark spores is a land plant synapomorphy, not seen in any of the closely related taxa, and therefore suggesting that those Ordovician spores came from a true land plant. Chemically, the spores have coats of sporopollenin, the material that land plants use to seal off their spores and pollen grains, preventing the insides of those cells from drying out when they're exposed to air. This chemical is something that would obviously not be expected in aquatic plants. And sure enough, you don't find it in the green algae or in the non-land plant streptophytes. It's another good land plant synapomorphy. Basically, there's enough evidence just from these spores alone that some kind of land plant was there to produce them. So even though we lack any fossils that could tell us what those plants actually look like, we can nonetheless be fairly certain of their existence in the Ordovician. By the time we get to the Silurian, there are better fossils, like this Cooksonia, a polysporangiophyte, and thus already more complex than the mosses and liverworts that we still have around today. We cover the taxonomic side of things in the next lecture, during which we'll go over the organization of the basal portion of the plant phylogeny, and in lab we'll be meeting some modern representatives of taxa that spring from the basal plant branches.